Card games and video games have been intertwined for as long as video games have existed. Nintendo got their start making Hanafuda cards. Every card game from poker to Chaotic has had some form of video game client. You just can't have video games as they exist today without some influence from, or even direct inclusion of, cards in some capacity. Some of these inclusions are merely aesthetic, like where your abilities are represented as cards, but they're still just normal action game abilities or whatever. But there are also countless video games that are fundamentally built around playing cards. And I'm sure that when I said I'm going to talk about card game video games, that a good number of you had a very specific game come to mind. Maybe some of you pictured something like Marvel Snap or Hearthstone or some other, hopefully better CCG. Or maybe you instantly assume this video is going to be about yet another person selling you on this little indie game called Slay the Spire, or the bottomless well of games that have been inspired by it, let's say. I love Slay the Spire, and I unfortunately do not have enough self-respect to uninstall Master Duel, but neither of those types of games are the games I want to talk about. I also want to quickly stress up front that these are not going to be reviews or holistic takes on these games in any capacity. I'm actively aiming to keep the discussions mostly spoiler-free as much as I can when it comes to the narrative details or just general juicy bits, and instead focus on why these games speak to me and why they might do the same for you. Obviously, by anyone's particular definition, anything I could possibly say about a game could be construed as a spoiler, and a few of these games do inherently need a few spoilers of at least a minor capacity to be talked about at all, but I'm of the opinion that sometimes a little spoiler can be a good thing. I think a great example of this is how Outer Wilds is a game where you really should go in as blind as possible, but you usually have to at least explain one thing about the game structure to hook people in. In an ideal world, you'd know nothing about Outer Wilds when you go into it, but you need something to hook you in and make you want to play in the first place. Besides, I know most of you won't even play the video game and watch video essays fully willing for everything to get spoiled just right up front. So while I'm not going to drop any major bombshells or anything, I will discuss the early hours of these games fairly freely in order to accurately convey what makes them so interesting to me. Specifically, I want to talk about games that use card mechanics as just an aspect of their gameplay and not the singular focus. Think less Pokemon TCG Live and more Pokemon TCG, like, the Game Boy game. For those unfamiliar, the original Pokemon TCG game on the Game Boy was a little RPG where you built a deck, and instead of having 6v6 Pokemon battles like in the mainline series, combat against characters was done via playing a match of the card game. Cards here are a direct one-for-one replacement for the conventional combat mechanics you normally see. It's a fairly simple change, but it's a decent example of the kind of mechanical nuance I wanted to talk about. I want the card mechanics that complement something larger as opposed to taking center stage. Even if the game's primary gameplay loops and mechanics are card-based, it should use those mechanics not just to present a straightforward card game with a winner and a loser at the end of a quick match, but a deeper gameplay or narrative experience on the level of other great video games. It's like how the best first-person shooters are the ones with the really engaging level design and thoughtful writing. You can play some very satisfying games that are just about shooting and nothing else, but it's the synthesis of gun mechanics with everything else that the game offers that's truly memorable. Half-Life 2 would be way less of a cultural landmark if it was just about the shooting. If you took a mainline Pokemon game and set it just in a battle tower where you had a random team of 6 you took up to a random procedurally generated wall of opponents, I don't think it would be nearly as popular. The mechanics would still grab people for sure, because they're fundamentally still the same game, but there's so much more to these games than just those core baseline mechanics, and I feel like card games can be the same way. While there are so many games that do lean on those basic core mechanics, you could really spiral it out in so many different ways. And no, I'm not going to talk about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Game where they reenact the War of the Roses with Yugi in the role of Henry Tudor. Yes, it exists, but I don't have the time or the energy for that right now. I'm also avoiding games that tie into existing real-world card games. I'm only really interested in discussing cards and card games that exist specifically for the video game they're a part of. There's plenty of awesome and awful tie-in games out there, but lingering on a game like Chef of Destruction or Wheelie Breakers would really kind of miss the point of the video, especially since my main goal of the video, beyond anything else, is to introduce you to some games you might not have seen before and tell you about something really neat and not some really massive already existing property from Konami. That's also partially why I'm not going to do a full-on section on Slay the Spire, considering just how popular it is. It's so popular that it's really shaped how a lot of card game systems and other video games are even approached in the first place. And while Slay the Spire itself may not have the layers that I'm looking for, it has at least inspired a few games that do. Slay the Spire itself, being such a subgenre-defining title, offers a blueprint that some use for the repetitive means, but others have iterated upon in many interesting ways. And I think none have iterated on it better than Daniel Mullins in his game Inscryption. Inscryption at the surface does seem like a fairly archetypical deck builder roguelite. You are given a few basic starting cards, then must route a path through a map facing battles and random encounters along the way, with a boss capping off each section of the run. It's a tried and true formula that countless games have riffed on, and I'm not really knocking on it either. This formula has existed for a while now, to a point where it does feel like a truly established subgenre within the world of deck builders itself. My main issue comes when so many games fail to really iterate on the genre's core concepts, and instead stick to very bare-bones approaches. Not every game has to be massive or full to the brim with story or ideas, but not every game should be Slay the Spire, but insert some minor gameplay tweak here. The actual game of Inscryption is quite fun. The sacrifice mechanics are interesting, and there's a limited number of zones, and hey, it's kind of like Caveman Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is funny because the game is overtly based on Magic since its creator was getting back into that game at the time, but it really does kind of ape on Yu-Gi-Oh! In a few ways. But that's just getting a bit distracted. The game is quite fun, although I do have to specify in this case that I am referring to the game specifically and its mechanics. You might be kind of curious why I felt the need to specify that, but Inscryption is one of those games where it likes to be all clever and name itself after a piece of fiction that exists within universe. So that means Inscryption is simultaneously the video game I am talking about and playing, a fictional retro video game that's also called Inscryption, which is kind of the video game I'm playing. I'm playing it through a bottle narrative. And then it's also a failed trading card game also called Inscryption that was then adapted into said retro video game that you're playing in the modern day video game through the aforementioned bottle narrative with a guy named Lucky Carter who is a YouTuber who does pack openings. Does that make any sense? No? Well, thankfully you've got both a whole game and an ARG to sit through to figure it out. I don't want to put the cart before the horse or anything, but there's a lot more to Inscryption than meets the eye. Leshy, the jolly green gilf hosting the game, actively invites you to stand up and walk around the cabin. At first this might seem just like an aesthetic set dressing choice, but before long, little pieces of a puzzle box start falling into place. Some of your cards start talking to you, and both insult your plays and insist things aren't exactly as they seem. And this isn't a repeating, looping narrative hook that just keeps repeating the same lines over and over again. It's a continuing story between your runs that will evolve the more you do. Even though each race set is technically a new victim and your previous character has been turned into a card by Leshy's camera, you, the player, are obviously still the same player, and the game does keep that in mind. And the more you engage with the puzzly elements, the more the game will alter and enhance the core card game. If you find a card tucked away in Leshy's safe, you can add it to your starting deck, or sometimes you can look at the game's rulebook and find something a bit more than just simple rules text. Most of the puzzles actively ask you not to just go between playing the puzzle and playing the card game, but to consider both at the same time. Many of the puzzles directly relate to card concepts or actively require solutions that involve doing something within your run or within the actual card game itself. Or, if a puzzle is in the house, it might require you to actively use your knowledge of the card game to unlock whatever's hiding behind it. There's a lot of nuance in Leshy's cabin, and at the risk of saying too much, there's far more to the game than even this. Inscryption has so much more to it than even I anticipated when I first played the game. I had gone into Inscryption having already watched playthroughs of 2018's Ludum Dare Game Jam entry Sacrifices Must Be Made. That game would eventually evolve into Inscryption, and while the core gameplay remains with the cards, the whole game around it has blossomed into something entirely new. If you finish this section of the video and go to play Inscryption, I can guarantee it will surprise you in multiple ways you will never see coming. In a way, it's almost limiting, since Inscryption, more than most games, actively does not want any spoilers, especially beyond its first couple hours. But this game is a lot more than meets the eye and certainly takes its core roguelite structure and turns it on its head several times over. Instead of potentially spoiling more, I'll instead take a moment to gush about just how beautiful the game is. It's a perfect game to play at late at night, and especially as close to as Halloween as one can manage. While it never quite dips into overt horror, the game definitely drips in an eerie atmosphere that is equal parts foreboding and often really visually stunning. The game really does a lot with its art direction, leaning more on stark shadows and colors as opposed to raw graphical fidelity. Everything feels remarkably fluid and really sells the whole experience something really special and put together well, especially compared to other, less refined deck builder roguelites that just simply ape on things that came before it. When a game is popular enough, it really is only natural for future games to try and homogenize around it. And Slay the Spire was such a great game, and I do have to stress, it was a great game, but it was so big, it really did set a standard for other games to follow, and many games that tried just felt like shallow imitations as opposed to actively expanding on what Slay the Spire did right. Inscription at the surface does lean into those established mechanics and tropes of the genre and presents a game that may at first just feel like a splash in the pan along with everything else that was inspired by its forebearers. However, Inscription wastes no time in showing you just what it has in store for you and sets up to reveal even more in short order. So if anything I've said spoke to you, then I say go check the game out. I don't want to give too much away, especially in regards to some of the twists and turns, so I should really just leave the Inscription talk here before I get in trouble for spoiling anything. I guess this is fine. Anyways, if Inscription could be considered a clever subversion of the deck builder roguelite genre, I consider the next game I want to talk about an outright deconstruction. Cultist Simulator is a game in which figuring out what your cards do and how to win is the actual game itself. I'm quite confident that I can't spoil Cultist Simulator for you because I don't even fully know how it functions. The game actively discourages you from looking up guides or advice and instead wants you to essentially fuck around and find out. Even when I came back to capture footage and refresh my thoughts on the game after playing it before, I found it dense and confusing to pick back up. But that's not in a way that turned me away from it or made me feel upset. Instead, I found the cryptic game concepts and confusing cards interesting, like pieces of a puzzle I'm trying to piece together. I can't think of another game where it felt so intensely like I was fucking around on the tip of the iceberg before slipping off the surface and plunging into the depths. You start off with very little things to do, but it quickly snowballs to a point where you're not really sure where you should be placing cards when you're not using them, let alone the best places and times to actively play the cards. There's this constant feeling of time slipping away from you, and it can really leave you feeling a bit overwhelmed. Sometimes a random event will pop up and suddenly you've got cops following you around and your dreams will spit out a new card that you really can't figure out the full function of for several more hours. You spend most of the early game with Cultist Simulator feeling around in the dark, trying to put together whatever connections you can find. Some are obvious, like how you can slot your health into menial labor to work a simple job, but others require you to make much larger logical leaps and experiment around, such as when you get sick and the game says medicine could help cure you. In most video games, that's a signal to find some medicine card or whatever to remove the ailment card. But there's no such thing as a medicine card. In Cultist Simulator, when the game says you need medicine, that means you play a money card alongside the ailment card, which then goes about the process of acquiring the medicine and curing you, basically off camera. While this is a minor example of the gameplay quirks, the layers of obfuscation and confusion can snowball into even larger misassumptions and errors. Once I got to a stage where I could actively start recruiting people, but could not fully recruit them since my cult didn't really exist. Like, I hadn't set a core belief system, and those tend to be pretty important to how cults, function, so it kind of makes sense why everything stalled out there. I had the option to set a doctrine and I could run that process whenever I wanted to, but none of the cards I had fit the slot. I tried plugging everything in I could and nothing really worked, and yeah, brute force kind of just is the name of the game sometimes, where you just plug things in and hope something works, and in this case, nothing did. That character died before they even found anything to believe in, let alone fully starting a cult. And that really is the only goal of the game. Form a cult. And while it may sound like a simple goal on paper, and WikiHow seems oddly confident in their little program to figure it out, the game hardly makes the path towards occult enlightenment easy for you. You start off with basically just the option to do menial labor to earn a single point of currency, and sometimes more, but not very much more in any starts, and while you will get more options in short succession, like dreaming or wandering around town, nothing will ever directly assist you in the process of ascending from this mortal plane for at least a little while. In fact, it's safe to say that most people won't even get to do any proper cult business for their first several runs. It's very rare that your first playthrough of Cultist Simulator ends in any way but a hospital bed. And unlike typical roguelites where you just shuffle up and go again, Cultist Simulator goes, alright, now you're the doctor who examined the body of your previous character and found their notes. It's never a direct continuation where you keep all of your resources, but there tend to be threads dangling around that connect things unless you actively choose to sever them by starting completely fresh. Sometimes you're directly related to the previous character, or a colleague, or some random rich kid who inherits something from a strange relative. These alternate starts help keep new runs fresh, since your early turns are never going to look absolutely the same each time. This is the sort of game where the satisfaction you find tends to be more out of the catharsis of figuring something out more than anything else. Many of the cards' descriptions are vague and can leave you with more questions than answers more often than not. It's a game where its very mechanics are the twists, and a top 10 helpful tips I wish I knew before playing guide is tantamount to having auto-aim in Valorant. But yet, despite how the game folds so easily with spoilers, its gameplay elements are so obscure and minimalistic in its display, even if you study this footage very carefully, I'm not sure how much you'd actually glean of the game's mechanics. While it is certainly a card game, it doesn't have the typical goals one might expect. There's no opponent beyond the slow crawl of time, but even then, that just means it's closer cousin to Solitaire than it is Magic the Gathering. In a way, this card game plays out almost more like a choose-your-own-adventure game or some sort of deconstructed life sim than it does your typical card game roguelite. While you are collecting and playing cards in a procedural gameplay loop, the actual game feels more like a mystery or a puzzle game where all of these cards are potential keys for all of the game's proverbial locks. I can't really imagine Cultist Simulator structured in a way that doesn't include the cards, and yet through the cards, the game leaves being a card game altogether. I can't help but wonder what came first, the idea of a card game or of a life simulator. Did the card game mechanics naturally lend themselves to becoming a life simulator, or did the life simulator opt to adopt cards for its game systems? At a glance, the two feel so intertwined, it really does almost feel like a moot point to even try and figure it out. Cultist Simulator is something of a mess to look at, let alone even play. It's easily the hardest game to recommend on this list, but definitely one of the most interesting gameplay experiences I've gone through. I love the idea of a game's rules themselves being something to puzzle out, where you are really just dropped into a game and have to explore your way through it. It can lead to frustrating moments for sure. By nature, this sort of game is built on the backbone of a deluge of cheap deaths early on that will very much drive some people away from the game altogether. And while some might see this as a creative choice that's just a bit too drastic considering how easily it can dissuade players, it leads to games with play patterns and experiences that are rather unique. Cultist Simulator certainly isn't on the level of a game like Outer Wilds that genuinely feels revolutionary with its figure-it-out-for-yourself gameplay loop, but Cultist Simulator does feel remarkably novel with how it takes its mechanical inspirations and whittles them into something entirely new. I've not played a game quite like Cultist Simulator before, and while I don't feel like it's a game for everyone, or even most people if I'm really being honest, it is a game that I feel deserves some form of recognition in how it approaches its mechanics and how it trusts the player to make mistakes and still push through. In a gaming climate where genuine heated debate sparked over if Dad of Boy 2 held the player's hand a bit too much, it can be pretty shocking to play a game where you are less dropped into the deep end and more given a pair of cement shoes by a guy who reeks of gabagool. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that we need more games like Cultist Simulator, but I do feel like we need more games that approach design in a similar fashion. It took established tropes and mechanics and peeled back the layers to reverse engineer them into a whole different sort of game. Instead of focusing on scaling procedural challenge for its replayability, instead it makes the act of understanding the game itself the reason to keep playing. Even if it's not a game you personally would find joy in playing, I think just about anyone can appreciate the axis on which the game approaches its design and how it engages players with its different systems. I have a soft spot for games that are actively competitive against the player. A game can force you to shoot a guy and go,
"Whoa, damn, that was fucked up, Bubbus. Why'd you kill that dude? He had like 3 kids and a dog. Now they're all gonna die because that dude was their like one lifeline and shit. That's real fucked up, man."
But that's not like a real strain on the player. You were forced to kill that person and then scolded by the game for playing it in the first place. In a game like Cultist Simulator, the design's game is barbed, intentionally off-putting to make you genuinely question, why am I playing this? It makes you genuinely contend with wanting to keep playing or not, but it's doing it quite intentionally. Of course, Cultist Simulator isn't actively trying to make you miserable. It's no Fear and Hunger or Pathologic. Cultist Simulator is more aiming for general confusion. It wants you to be apprehensive and uncertain about the moves you make, let alone their future implications several minutes down the line. The game wants you to consider giving up, turning away from your occult desires in a way that many aspirants give up their own pursuit of forbidden knowledge. And you also really should not look at a wiki, at all. You should really try and pursue that knowledge as blindly as possible. This game loses almost all of the wind in its sails if you start learning mechanics beforehand. In that sense, I really do feel like Cultist Simulator should almost be approached as if it were a puzzle game. It's the sort of game where the act of discovery is the draw in and of itself, where the game is less about the end point and far more about actually just getting there in the first place. Once you unravel the mysteries of how the game works, it's not going to be quite the same anymore. But that doesn't lessen the journey. If anything, having such a conclusive endpoint, such strong mastery where the game eventually loses meaning because you have mastered its systems, actively enhances the journey to get there. Once you have mastered occult knowledge, you don't need to learn it again. You've peered into the abyss and it peered back, and you're forever changed for it. Both of the games I've mentioned thus far have been in some form a permutation of the idea of a deck builder roguelite. For someone who's talked a lot about avoiding Slay the Spire type games, I sure have both mentioned it and games inspired by it a lot so far. It really is unavoidable. I have to mention Slay the Spire because its success solidly set deck builder roguelites as vogue. They've become the de facto genre expected when someone mentions a game with deck building elements because they're just so ubiquitous. It's such a foregone conclusion in the current discussion of the genre that whenever I introduced the next game I wanted to talk about, people would almost always assume that I was instantly talking about a roguelite until I told them otherwise. This next game is not a roguelite. It's kind of a RPG tower defense hybrid. It's certainly also a visual novel. The central gameplay does focus on collecting cards and building decks for several party members as you progress through a story, and said story is the typical cyberpunk horror seinen with magical powers, SCPs, warring crime syndicates, head replacement prosthetics, extensive references to the Kabbalah, and the main plotline can only be fully understood with prior knowledge of an Italian poem from 1532. But that's a little bit to unpack, so let's rewind a bit. Library of Ruina is the second game in Project Moon's absolutely balls to the fucking wall extended universe that would feel right at home on a shelf tucked between a copy of Fire Punch and your well-loved paperback copy of the Sefer Yeritza. Beyond any sort of gameplay aspect, first and foremost, Library of Ruina's world building and narratives are easily one of its biggest draws. That's not me saying the game is bad, far from it in fact, but given how rarely card game video games these days tend to focus on plot, it's a welcome surprise to see a game so heavily focused on establishing a world and the characters that live in it. The city is a horrible near-future nightmare where every night sweepers go down the streets and just eat people to help keep the population numbers down. And that's one of the city government sanctioned monstrosities at play. That's one of the nicer things that could happen to you, is being eaten by one of those things. As you dive more into this macabre world and the main characters forced to live in it, you find yourself getting hooked on pretty quickly as they run you through the whole power structure of the nested wing system of the city. This is in no short part thanks to how the story ties so closely to the game's mechanics. You play as Roland, a low-level fixer who is essentially a freelancer who will do anything from courier work to assassination in this dangerous city, and you get roped into managing this game's namesake library. This library is very upfront about its paranormal nature. In fact, pretty much everything in the city is. You'll learn that fairly early on. It invites guests in with the promise of books on basically any topic they can imagine, as long as they can beat the library staff in combat. If they lose, they get turned into new books, which in turn are full of new juicy information that will then lure in new important people, essentially creating this chain of bait to lure in bigger and bigger rubes until the library consumes all of the information it could possibly want. You, as Roland, take over the duties of handling the guest receptions. Receptions are card battles where you and your assistant librarians on that floor face off against whoever has come to the library for books. When you defeat someone and book them, you can collect their pages from that book to serve as cards for your decks. These cards can both be the actual physical cards in the deck, but also passive identity pages that can change your character's stats and passives. The card game is deceptively simple at first, with rather basic cards that boil down to high number wins plus a side of the, I guess you'd call it the Fire Emblem weapon triangle, I suppose. Almost like Pokemon typings, but not as important. You get the deal. But the game quickly spikes up the complexity as you not only deal with new cards, but also deal with opening up new floors in your library and having to build even more decks. And between all the different guests you have to fight and all the different cards you can harvest between them, there's so many options for how you can approach the deck and team building itself. In a way, deck building in Ruina almost feels like building decks in real life. You have a collection of cards you can only stretch so far. And in the case of Ruina, you have to keep making more decks to counter both the current guests of the chapter, as well as just to have enough floors able to compete in encounters in the first place. You will often have to have several competent decks at the ready for any given reception, which means you'll have to put real consideration into building decks and stretching your card pool more, or grinding out more cards from encounters. Many of the game's most difficult chapters include receptions that take place over multiple rooms, with some dizzying boss rushes. You definitely need to be ready for some of these fights. Ruina is a beefy game, by far the longest game on this list, with people who get to the ending usually dumping at least 100 hours into it. It's just one of those games where the hours kind of just fly by. It's got a dense story and pretty engaging gameplay, so you'll just kind of wind up burning the midnight oil sometimes through several play sessions as you increase your library's notoriety and become one of the biggest hotspots in the city. Every line of dialogue is also fully voice acted, which I think is pretty impressive for a game with a cast both this big and this expendable, not to mention just how long the game is itself. The voice acting is of course all in Korean, but you still get so much personality and tone from the voices alone. Even if you don't understand the language, it will add so much to the actual cutscenes. The main cast of librarians all have strong, unique personalities that come through with their performances, such as Netsach sounding like he's always just about to fall asleep on you, and then Tipperef sounding like she's constantly huffing while standing on her tiptoes just to get a bit more height while she argues with you. I absolutely adore some of the audio effects in the more robotic or monstrous characters.
압니다. 밤중에 가족이 제대로 식사할 수 있는 곳이 점차 적어지고 있다는 걸 압니다.
So many characters have really unique speech quirks or just inhuman distortions that really shine through even not knowing the language. It's important to note that Ruina is the second game in a franchise, although the three games are all fairly loosely tied together and can be played in whatever order makes you happy, especially since if I made you follow the real reading order chart, we'd be here for a while. Ruina does a good job of catching you up to the events of Lobotomy Corporation if you haven't played the first game. What I'm saying is that there's no correct jumping in point for the Project Moon universe, and I even actually personally started with Library of Ruina, and it hooked me onto the setting and the franchise almost instantly. The game's plot starts as almost a reverse Monster of the Week, where a different group comes by every chapter and then you book them. As your threat level increases in the city, you become more privy to the power players at hand, as well as the greater plans of both your boss Angela and Roland himself. Even though it takes a while for the game to start diving into the deeper lore of things, it does a great job of hooking you in with interesting characters and some genuinely grim scenarios that paint the city very strongly in your mind, despite the player character never actually leaving the library once. And in turn, the game's design helps build up those moments for even greater narrative payoff down the line. Without saying too much, there are moments where the cards themselves can be clues to lore or story beats. A character's identity might come into question if the names of their weapons and their cards are oddly impersonal, listing names of workshops they're from instead of the actual names the weapons actually had. Or a card might represent a distinct memory of that character that they don't overtly talk about in the scene, but is still lingering in their mind during the fight. Sometimes these cards are the unspoken exposition, or further context for motives and thought processes of your opponent. The cards in Ruina represent the psyche of the character or the actions they take, and as such they carry more narrative weight and significance than a random card you got for clearing another encounter on a roguelite run, especially since you won't chuck this card away and hope you randomly find it again. Once you have a card in Library of Ruina, it's yours to keep. There's no collection resetting or starting over from scratch every time you want to play like you would with a roguelite. The concepts at play in this universe are fairly dark, but I don't think the series ever really revels in being outright edgy. There's a narrative heart to what's shown in Ruina, with the point clearly being that you're not supposed to grab a bucket of popcorn and go
fuck yeah
when the warp train stalls out and the worst things possible happen. The best horror uses shocking imagery to say something, and I think Ruina does that quite well. It's not just there for shock value, it's there to actually say something about the world and, the people in it. While many people just cannot stomach these games in any capacity, and for good reason, there's a lot of content warnings that could go with this game, and they should be very much appreciated because they are needed. But if you are the kind of person who can handle that stuff and like off-the-wall genre plotlines, you're absolutely going to find something in Ruina you like. There's cannibal chefs, masochist musicians, weavers who eat people to make magical silk that they use to make the fancy anime clothes that people wear, which is canonically stronger than combat armor even, murder carnival carnivals, people who explode into needles that if they stab you, also make you explode into even more needles. Oh, but don't worry though, the world of Ruina is so over the top that that explosive needle plague was stopped by a single blue-haired woman with a cello. Library of Ruina is really one of those games I could talk about for ages. Part of me does kind of want to talk about it some more, or specifically maybe about the new game, Limbus Company. So if you are interested in hearing about that, let me know and I'll maybe make that mistake. But for now, I just merely wanted to give a taste of what makes Ruina just so fascinating. In a market saturated with deck builders where your cards are mostly left up to pure random chance and you're not going to have a deck together longer for than an hour, it's a game that actively asks you to build up a card pool and spread it over a variety of decks you're going to be tweaking and changing over the course of 100 hours. The lore bounces from genuinely thoughtful allusions to classic literature to even more thoughtful riffs on classic internet urban legends, and bathes them all in enough anime tropes to make weebs embarrass themselves by not realizing the game is Korean. I've not really seen a setting that felt quite like the Project Moon universe. The new game Limbus Company made Ishmael from Moby Dick and Don Quixote from some book I forgot the title of, but it made those characters into girls and I love them. It's also got some of the most fucked up horror concepts I've gotten to chew on for a while, and is absolutely perhaps one of the least fun fictional settings to possibly live in. And while most video games that have card mechanics use them as a singular focus, or a quick shorthand for another mechanic, Ruina has it actively built into the game systems and it's built their narrative around it. The two are just inherently linked. You cannot have Ruina's card game without its story, and the story would not work half as well without its cards. Card games are inherently more disconnected than other games since cards are inherently representative. There's no such thing as a literal card game, since every card will by default be a stand-in for something else. Maybe your card's a monster, or it's a spell you've cast, or it's the boots you're wearing. Hell, if we want to go back far enough to as early as cards can really get, we can get really pedantic and include this asshole. For as long as we've had cards, cards have represented something else. While this means the gameplay in a card game video game will have an inherent disconnect, it also means that with careful design and structure, the card's inherent representation can make up for any disconnection. Library of Ruina's cards represent memories and thoughts, which is a game design concept that shares with the last game I'm going to talk about today. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a narrative role-playing game centered on a decade in the lives of the first generation of human children not born on Earth. An idealist group of sci-fi fans banded together around a positive futurism of one author so much that they formed a real belief system strong enough that it led them to leave the planet and settle a new home through a wormhole. Your parents are two of the founding members of this group and leaders in the eventual colony. They give birth to you on the ship, and you spend most of your formative years making early connections from a narrative stance and from a gameplay stance, setting your opening stats and some of the opening cards you have in your deck. After a rough landing on your new home of Vertumna a few days before your 10th birthday, what follows is a month-by-month recounting of the following decade as you grow into an adult alongside your childhood friends. Each month you select a task to do that will raise certain stats and social bonds, and then progress through the story visual novel style. Where the game deviates from your typical RPG is that instead of having an in-baked combat system, every skill check in the game is done via a card game. Hey, that's kinda like that Pokemon game we talked about at the start. How about that? It's almost like somebody planned that. The card game's actually quite simple in practice. It's essentially a mixture of Sudoku with Texas Hold'em, which does sound a bit weird now that I'm saying it out loud, but I promise it makes sense. You're dealt a hand of cards from your deck and must place a certain number of them into a row in front of you. Each card has a suit as well as a point value, and thus the pairs, straights, flushes, and all the other sorts of poker hands one might expect come into play and have point values here. If you score enough points to clear the threshold, you pass the skill check and you're good to go. Bigger events might have multiple phases with new hands dealt each time, and a more difficult skill check might have a higher point total than a more easy one. It's never a system that feels all that difficult beyond maybe not having enough stats in hand to clear a certain challenge. And the core card gameplay doesn't get more complicated with time either. If anything, the actual mechanics of the card game just get more simple as they go along, to a point where it can almost feel automatic to play the card game itself. Your mind will just see the hands form themselves, and you'll see the optimal slots, and you'll just kind of go from there. The actual thought comes more from your deck itself. While obviously you want high scoring cards, it's not so simple as just picking out the cards you want and removing the ones you don't. These cards are your memories, even more literally than Ruina treated appreciated the concept. Your starting deck consists of stuff like your first steps and first words, and over time as you live your life out, new events form new memories. As such, the most common way of gaining a card is just by simply doing stuff. Dialogue will often tell you if it's going to reward you with a card based on what you say, and not every card is inherently a reward. Some cards have inherent downsides or just pretty abysmal stats. There may be times where you feel a slight pull towards actively not picking a certain dialogue option because the card it wants to give you is just that bad for your deck. This isn't a roguelite where you just go again either. You're playing a 10-year long story and that card is stuck in your deck till you find a way to remove it. In the early game, you can only remove cards from your deck whenever you take that month off to rest instead of doing any of your typical activities. You only really want to rest whenever you absolutely have to, considering how much of the game's story and events requires you to go out and do things. As such, opportunities to remove bad cards from your deck can be fairly scarce, and any card you are given is liable to be stuck there for quite some time. The real strength of Exocolonist comes in how it ties this into the game at large. This card mechanic takes a collection of your character's memories and uses them as tangible tokens used to pass skill checks. Your memories from studying and then winning the science fair come into play as you use that information to pass a science check. But even that's a bit too focused on the pure mechanic side of things. These cards, more than anything else, are just a scrapbook of your playthrough, tokens of things that you have done right and wrong throughout the game. And it asks you to consider all of these little things that you have done and the consequences that they've had as you keep playing. Those memories only go away if you actively choose to get rid of them, meaning the reminders will cling to you throughout your entire playthrough and maybe even into future ones. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is a game that almost needs to be played more than once. The game's cold open is a dream sequence. It involves a catastrophic event that you are waking up in the midst of. You're helped out of the rubble by a friend you feel like you've known for years, you are so distant from you can't even recall a name. You step out into the glow, a season you know by heart, but yet the bioluminescence that heralds arrival is something you have never looked at with your actual eyes. You are approached by a beast that looks at first like a dog, then in a moment like something you've never seen in your entire life. It snaps at you and you awaken and begin your life on the spaceship and eventually the colony. But from that very opening sequence onwards, the idea of premonition and fate lingers in the air. Most games have a certain ludonarrative dissonance when it comes to the idea of repeat playthroughs. If you've already gotten to the ending and saved the day, there's no real reason to go back and do it again, and if you do, nobody will really notice, least of all your player character. But this game leans into the idea of repeat playthroughs from the onset, telling you right from the get-go that your character can and will think about things from their other lives and how it might affect their current one. Every video game, when you play it long enough, does kind of just become Groundhog Day, but this game realized that and actively ran with it. I can't even pretend it's a spoiler to say all this, since the game openly revels in embracing the idea of a time loop just in the opening section. On the topic of spoilers, I won't go into too much detail about how this game can branch and change even through one playthrough, let alone multiple. It's rare that I finish a game and then so instantly, so feverishly start it right over again. It's even rarer that I do that and actually continue to feel that excitement past the opening section. Most games bog you down with that slow introduction that really reminds you that you could be doing other things or trying out something new. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist almost instantly validates you for starting a second playthrough and shows you that the first playthrough kind of was the slow introduction, and now the real game has finally begun. And instead of this feeling like a second playthrough, it now feels like you're continuing your main playthrough. There's so many different bits of this game that I have not seen, and I've beaten it multiple times and gotten very drastic endings, and now I have a lot more I still can see. I just love this game. I could probably do a whole video essay on a single character alone, let alone, its entire overarching plot or ideas. Other games in the genre would just have simple stat checks where if you pass, you pass, and if you fail, you fail. It's just all about the number you have. Heck, this game even has an option to decide skill checks randomly if you'd rather do that, but I really do not recommend it. Part of what makes this game so engaging is that it asks you to constantly and mechanically engage with the choices that you've made and the experiences that you've had. While some of the cards are pretty basic, and after a while seeing some of the early game cards will annoy you more than they'll actually provoke any deeper thoughts, there's still this whole extra angle that similar games just never even go down. There were moments in playthroughs where we're looking at certain memory cards after not having drawn them for a while did make me feel emotional again as I thought about that scene for the first time in probably a few hours. And that's just one aspect of why this game feels so great. It also has this really stellar lo-fi soundtrack that can really blend into the background at moments, but knows exactly when to kind of pop out and make itself noticed and stick with you. The art's also all fantastic, and I love seeing all the characters age throughout the years. There's some very clever thoughts on exobiology and a fully fleshed out ecosystem with various factors at play that you'll have to consider not just narratively, but also as a part of major aspects of the gameplay. It's a game that asks you to consider the world you inhabit, especially considering it is not fully yours to control. I also personally love that the game lets you be fully trans if you want, and even has entirely customizable pronouns and gendered term sets, with perhaps the most extensive system I've seen for that in any game I've played. The characters are all very well written and very much feel right for their ages at each respective age, maturing and changing over time but still feeling like the same person throughout. And the world they all live in feels really built up enough to really truly live in, even with all the little quirks to make it stand out so differently from our own world. I can't talk too much more about what makes the game tick without tipping its hand more than the game already does with its introduction. When I think of similar games, my mind of course goes to dating sims, and while you can certainly date in this game and it has many of the same mechanical trappings, it really does feel like so much more than that in Exocolonist. It is a game far less concerned about letting you kiss a bunch of cute characters or whatever, and is much more interested in exploring the heart of growing up in such a tumultuous time and place. Given the nature of the game and just how many time slots there are, it's very easy to miss scenes and details from multiple playthroughs and always have something new to find in the next one. The game remembers choices you made, not just in this playthrough but often in previous ones, and really plays with the idea of information that you, the player, would remember. It's also got really great writing that got me very misty-eyed a few times, and that setting and story are still rotating in my brain to this very day. Again, I could really probably write a whole essay on just a few of these characters, especially Dis and Tangent. Yeah, I'm not that surprising. Of course, I like Dis and Tangent. I'm not subtle. All of this is to say that while at face value I Was a Teenage Exocolonist might look like some sort of just quote-unquote basic dating sim, I would actually say the game shares a lot more DNA with Zero Escape or even something like Undertale than it does a basic visual novel. Also, some dating sims are more like Undertale than just typical visual novels, but that's a whole video essay someone much smarter than me has already made, so you can just go watch that one. I Was a Teenage Exocolonist is the game I'd personally recommend more than any others on this list. Beyond being the most accessible and generally pleasing of the four, it also really demonstrates that how even cards at their most simple can be very engaging and can slot into all sorts of different places in a game. It uses its cards in a novel way and uses them primarily as a backbone to support the greater narrative as opposed to being just the central focus. Its cards are simultaneously the part of the game you will see the most, and yet the part of the game that's also the most optional, to a point where it can be actively circumvented if a player doesn't wish to play it. And even beyond the cards themselves, the game's narrative and mechanics branch out through multiple playthroughs in a way that I've only seen done in a few other games. It's a game that has a little bit of something for everyone, I think, and it's a game that'll be stuck in my head personally for quite some time, and I'll probably keep playing it for even more. The four games I've talked about in this video are all radically different to their core. They're all built around playing cards, sure, and most of them require you to build a deck of some sort, but beyond that, they all have vastly different goals, themes, and even mechanics. Card games tend to be pigeonholed these days into what's already been proven successful. No need to make a whole new card game when you can just port the one that nerds already play in real life to a digital client and just make bank. And there really is nothing stopping an indie dev from looking at the countless Slay the Spire clones and going,
oh, why not just do that?
It's at a point where I feel like when people think of cards in video games, they just instantly assume it's either an existing real-life card game or some very derivative game based on one they've already played before. I didn't even touch on anything like Yoko Taro's Voice of Cards, a series of RPGs where even the map you traverse on is made of cards laid out in a grid pattern. They look really neat, I just haven't played them myself, so I really can't say much. But I definitely want to see more stuff kind of like this. I want games that take the idea of playing with cards and really run with it and stretch it out into new and different ways. Even if the cards are a basic system within the game, that basic system can go on to inform not just how the game is played, but how you, the player, engage with the narrative. I hope this video has given you a few games you're at least somewhat interested in checking out, or at the very least I hope you have a bit more of an appreciation for how cards can show up in video games. They're an often overlooked mechanic, written off as a foregone conclusion without much room for any new depth, but there's a lot of nuance in the near limitless potential that they offer to games. Card games don't have to just be mini-games tucked into RPGs that give you unlockables to grind for, or predatory web clients that want to take all your money. With some effort, cards can really be used to do just about anything in a game. game. Other than that, I think I've rambled on just about long enough. Thank you all again for the great response on the previous video. I won't fool myself into thinking that this video will be anywhere near as successful. I know lightning doesn't strike twice like that, but I do want to thank any of you who did show up from the last video and stuck around to watch this one. And if you did find me off of this video for the first time, I thank you for sticking to the end, and maybe I'll see you for the next one. And I actually am quite curious if you have any games that you feel like would be related to this topic you want to talk about in the comments. Other than that, I just hope you take care, are in great health, and just have a lovely day.